The term retro game gets thrown around a lot in the gaming community, but has anyone ever really sat down and objectively defined what makes a game retro? Well, yes they have, but based on what I've seen, there's still not a universally accepted definition among gaming enthusiasts. Personally, I've been thinking about this for a long time now, and I really wanted to make a video on the topic, but it's been a lot harder than I originally anticipated to get my thoughts together. However, I was finally able to come up with what I believe to be the main schools of thought, if you will, when it comes to defining a game, or console for that matter, as retro. There's a total of 4 of these, and we're going to go through them in order and talk about their plausibility. Now, I'm not promising I'll be able to conclusively determine beyond a shadow of a doubt what a retro game is, but at the very least I'd like to expand the discussion on the topic so maybe one day we can come to some sort of a conclusion. But without further ado, let's just get right into it. So, to start off, let's talk about the simplest and most widely used metric for determining if a game or console is retro, the number of years since its release. In my opinion, this way of looking at things is really good in theory, but doesn't perform as well as you would probably originally think when put into practice. Being able to just say any game or console that came out before this date is retro and anything that came after is not would be a great thing and would make the process of figuring out if a game is in fact retro very easy, but that's only possible if we're able to pick a date or date range that works in all cases. So, for example, let's say we come up with the idea that anything released before the year 2000 is retro. This sounds like it could be a good rule, but then where does that put the GameCube and the PS2? Are those consoles not retro? I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that would consider them retro consoles, so then what do? Do we move the date up to like 2005? Well, that would then conflict with a different group of gaming enthusiasts' beliefs about retro games, so which one is right? The problem is they're both right in their own way, which is the root of the problem with this system. There's no possible way that everyone's going to be able to agree on a specific date or number of years since a game's release, and that's why we can't rely on this for a definitive answer, even if it is the most popular system among gamers. The next school of thought is somewhat similar to the previous one, but it does have enough differences to allow it to stand on its own 2 feet in my opinion. That school of thought is the number of console generations behind a console or game is when compared to the current generation. Now you might be thinking, but wouldn't this still cause arguments among the community? And while that is true, I think picking a number of generations behind a console must be to beat retro would be much easier than picking a date. The number of options are much more limited with this system, so I could potentially see a consensus being made here unlike the previous metric. However, that doesn't mean this system is without issue. For example, let's say we decide that in order for a game or console to be retro, it has to be at least 3 generations old. Well, where then would that leave consoles like the PSP? Sony only ever had 2 generations of handheld consoles, so are those just eternally new systems? I think you see the problem. So, if we were to use this metric to measure if a game or console is retro, we'd also have to lay out some other rules to allow for contingencies like with the Sony handhelds. One option would be to combine this system with the previous one and have a metric where the majority of games and consoles are determined to be retro if they're a certain number of console generations back, and the few exceptions that remain use age. This does bring along with it the problems that the first system had, but at least this time things are on a smaller scale, so there's at least a chance we could agree on something. Now, to me, this seems like an okay system for determining if a game is retro or not, but let's consider all the possible schools of thought before we make any decisions. The next school of thought is one that we all use all the time without thinking about it, and that is what I'll be calling perspective retro. What is perspective retro exactly, I hear you ask, and that's a great question. As the name implies, perspective retro is the process of arbitrarily deciding if a game or console is retro or not based on your personal viewpoint. In other words, think of it like this. To me, someone who has been playing video games since way back in the 90s, a console like the Nintendo Wii doesn't qualify as a retro system based solely on my experiences with the console and its relative newness when compared to other consoles I've had my fun with. However, to someone a bit younger than me, maybe even born after the Wii released, that console could seem like an ancient relic. Therefore, in such a person's mind, the Wii and its many games would be classified as retro, even though from my perspective that's just not the case. This difference of perspectives is most likely where a lot of the arguments over retro classification are born, so as you might guess, this isn't the best way to solve the issue we're trying to solve here today. The last metric on the list is of course my personal favorite, technological specifications. This is very obviously the idea that we can measure the retroness of a game or console based on the type of technology it utilizes. A common example of this would be games from the 2D era versus games from the 3D era. Many people, even today, believe that if a game uses 3D graphics, that it can't be called a retro game. Now personally, I don't agree with this, but that is one way of classifying things here. Another example of such a rule would be games from before the CD era and games from after the CD era. One could refer to these eras as BCD and ACD. With this system, the cutoff to be considered retro would be the SNES and other consoles of that generation. Everything from the N64 onwards would be quote-unquote modern gaming. Now you might have noticed that this is essentially the same as the 2D versus 3D system, but in this case, rather than the graphics being the focal point, it's the game media. This goes to show the many different angles we could approach this system from. If you're wondering what I believe would be the best use for this system, well, it would be the following. At the current juncture in the gaming landscape, games and consoles that can and should be considered retro are those that released in the era pre-high-definition TV. This would mean that everything from the GameCube, PS2, and original Xbox era and back would be retro, with those that came after being modern. Now, of course, I'm aware that this is just my opinion, and there is definitely some bias in there, but I really do believe this to be a good rule of thumb, at least for the time being. Now, as for the reason why I like this particular system so much, well, that's actually very simple. The reason is that by looking at things from a technological perspective, we can get rid of a lot of the problems with arbitrary classification that other metrics suffer from. You can't just say I believe things from the year 2001 and back are retro. There has to be some logical and technological foundation to why you're cutting things off at a certain point. This should make it much easier for everyone to understand where you're coming from when you pose a potential cutoff, at least in theory. So, what did you guys think? Did you agree with my proposed retro game metric, or was there maybe something I missed? Maybe you prefer a different system altogether. Whatever the case may be, leave a comment down below and help me gain the favor of the algorithm gods. And of course, if you did happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Hack out. Yes, I know it's been a month since my last video, but don't worry, I am still alive, as you can clearly see. So, that's something. Have a good one.